Hello and welcome back to the deep dive. We're so glad to have you with us. Today, we are turning our attention to a dynamic that I think will resonate almost immediately with anyone working in, say, field service, operations, or technical management. We're looking at a phenomenon that, well, it dictates the quality of life for almost everyone in these industries, yet it rarely makes it onto a P&L statement or a quarterly report. It's this invisible force, but a really heavy one.
It is the kind of thing that if you're in operations, you feel it in your chest long before you can actually name it.
Exactly. We're exploring a concept called lived operational pressure.
Mm.
We're working from a structural analysis titled The Accumulating Burden When Humans Become the System. And the mission for this deep dive is really to trace the anatomy of burnout. But to be specific, we aren't talking about I worked too many hours this week kind of burnout. We're talking about the specific exhaustion that comes from holding a company together when the processes fail to do so.
Right. And it's so important to set the stage here with the right intent. This isn't a critique of management styles. It's not a lecture on wellness or work-life balance.
Yeah.
This is a systems engineering discussion. The core argument of the source material is that the overwhelm people feel is usually a rational response to a structural deficit. If you feel like you are carrying the weight of the operation, it's likely because the system has effectively offloaded its core functions onto your memory.
That is a significant reframe, offloading functions onto memory.
Amazing.
So let's look at the central paradox the source material presents. You have these thriving businesses, fire protection, security, facilities management. On paper, they're successful. Revenue is climbing, headcount is growing, but inside, leadership feels less like they're steering a ship and more like they're constantly plugging leaks in a dam.
It's the success trap. The fundamental question is, why does growth, which is the objective of the business, eventually start to feel dangerous? And to understand that, the source argues we have to look at the life cycle of complexity. It breaks this down into distinct phases, starting right from the beginning.
Let's start there. Phase one, the illusion of simplicity. This is the startup phase or, the small team phase.
Picture a small fire protection outfit. Maybe 5 technicians, 1 owner, 1 admin. At this stage, operations are incredibly efficient. But they aren't efficient because of sophisticated software. They're efficient because of what we call tribal knowledge.
High context, low volume. Everyone knows everything.
Exactly. The owner recognizes the handwriting of every technician. The ops manager knows that the client at 500 Main Street hates it when you park in the back loading dock. The coordination happens via memory and informal chat. You ask, hey, did you fix that valve? They say, yeah, I did. And that's the end of the workflow.
And it works. That's the seductive part, right? It feels agile. It feels responsive.
It works because the environment is forgiving. That's the term the source uses. A forgiving environment has slack. If you forget to log a job, you remember it 2 hours later, call the tech, and it gets fixed. No harm, no foul. The cognitive load, the amount of mental RAM required to run the business, is well within the limits of the human brain.
So nobody feels burdened yet. The human system works perfectly fine. But then obviously you want to grow. You want more clients. And this brings us to phase two, which the source calls the subtle shift. Now, I think most people assume this shift is just about volume. More jobs equals more stress.
That's the common misconception. If it were just volume, you could solve it linearly. You could just hire more people. But the source argues the real killer isn't volume, it's variation.
Okay, let's distinguish that. What does variation look like in this specific context?
Volume is doing the same simple inspection 100 times instead of 10. Variation is doing 100 inspections, but 20 of them are for a new client with different SLA requirements, 10 are in a hazardous environment requiring specific permits, and 5 are on legacy systems that your new hires don't know how to fix.
Right. So complexity isn't additive here. It's combinatorial.
Precisely. In facilities management, for instance, you might pick up a portfolio of heritage buildings. Suddenly, your standard operating procedure doesn't apply. You need version B of the process. Then you get a client in the healthcare sector. Now you need version C for sterile environments.
And this is where the human system starts to creak, right? Because the software usually just has one field for job description. It doesn't inherently know about version A, B, or C.
This is the pivotal moment. As complexity rises, the standard tools calendars, basic job management apps, they stop providing enough context. So what does a diligent employee do?
They compensate.
They compensate.
Enter the sticky note.
The sticky note, the whiteboard, the spreadsheet saves on a desktop named Important Tracking V2.
Oh, I've seen this 100 times. The shadow system.
But here's the insight that is so validating. The source emphasizes that creating these shadow systems is a rational act.
Hmm.
It's not people being disorganized. It is people realizing that the official system, the software, doesn't capture the nuance required to do the job safely. So they build a bridge. They use their own memory and manual tools to bridge the gap between the system and reality.
So the pressure we talked about in the intro,
Yeah.
that is the weight of that bridge.
Yes. But in phase two, it's still just annoying. It feels like an inconvenience. Oh, I have to double check this. Phase three is where the tone changes. This is when safety becomes anxiety.
And this applies specifically to our listeners in regulated industries. Life safety, electrical, HVAC, security.
If you run a coffee shop and forget an order, you have an annoyed customer. If you run a fire protection company and you forget a compliance certificate, you have a legal liability. As variation increases, the risk of a miss becomes existential.
The source brings up a really sharp technical point here about data gaps. It says traditional software records what was entered, but it cannot record what should have been entered.
That is the crux of the anxiety. Think about a job management system. It shows job complete. You see a green check mark. But does that check mark mean the technician actually uploaded the specific photo required by the new 2024 regulations? Or does it just mean they hit the done button on their phone?
The system is blind to the absence of data.
Correct. It's a system of record, not a system of responsibility. It stores data. It doesn't understand obligations. And because the operations manager knows this blind spot exists, they can never truly relax. They know the green check mark is unverified.
So they start auditing manually.
They become human error checkers. You see managers spending their entire Friday reviewing job sheets line by line. They aren't doing strategy. They're doing forensic accounting on their own operations because they are terrified of an audit.
And that leads to phase 4, mental exhaustion and the constantly on mindset. I found this section really interesting because it redefines time pressure.
Usually when we say we're busy, we mean we're working fast. But the source argues that at this stage, the exhaustion comes from open loops.
Walk us through that concept.
It's cognitive science. The brain struggles to rest when it knows there's an unresolved task. In this environment, an ops manager might have 50 open loops in their head. Did Steve remember the gate code? Did we send the quote for the remedial work? Did that invoice go out?
Because the system isn't closing those loops for them.
The system is passive. So the human has to actively maintain the state of every project in their working memory. The source calls this reconstructing events. You aren't just moving forward, you're constantly looking backward, playing detective on work that happened 3 days ago to make sure it was done right.
That sounds incredibly inefficient. You're doing the work, and then you're doing the work of checking the work.
It's cognitive debt. Just like technical debt in code, you're paying interest on every disorganized process. And the currency you pay with is burnout. You see technicians who are great with their hands failing because they're exhausted by the administrative mental load. They aren't tired from turning wrenches. They're tired from trying to remember if they clicked the right 3 buttons in the app while the customer was watching them.
Which brings us to the hard reality of business. Money. Phase 5 connects this operational mess to financial fragility.
This is where the finance director or the CFO gets involved. In service industries, revenue is tied to demonstrability. You cannot bill for what you cannot prove.
If the report isn't signed or the photo isn't there, the invoice gets disputed.
Exactly. If your operational data is messy, if you have those data gaps we talked about, your days sales outstanding, your DSO, starts to creep up. You did the work in January, but you're still fighting with the client in March because the documentation is incomplete.
That creates a terrible feeling for a business owner. You're busy, everyone is working overtime, but the cash flow is erratic.
It creates a sense of exposure. And this triggers the behavior the source identifies as the protective leader.
Now, usually when we describe a leader who's checking everything and refusing to delegate, we call them a micromanager. We imply they have trust issues.
And the source pushes back on that hard. It says, this isn't an ego trip. It is not that they want to control everything. It is that they are the only safety net left.
They're the human middleware.
That is a very accurate way to put it. They know that if they step away, the system, which is actually just a loose collection of spreadsheets and memory, will fail. So they step in, they check the invoices, they route the technicians, they become the bottleneck. Not because they want power, but because they're protecting the business from its own lack of structure.
But the cost of that protection is stagnation. And this leads to phase 6, the stagnation point.
It's the logical conclusion. If the business relies on you personally checking every job to prevent disaster, then you cannot grow. Doubling a business would mean doubling you, and that's impossible.
So growth stops feeling like an opportunity. It starts to look like a threat.
Leaders start turning down work. They say we're at capacity. But they aren't at market capacity. They are at cognitive capacity. The human system is maxed out.
So the typical response here, and I think everyone listening has tried this or considered it, is to buy more technology. We need a dashboard. We need a better app. Let's get an API integration.
The more software fallacy. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive part of the analysis. The source argues that adding more tools often increases the mental load rather than reducing it.
How does that happen? Automation is supposed to save time.
Automation saves manual time, but often increases coordination time. If you buy a separate safety app, a separate vehicle tracking app, and a separate accounting package, where does the truth live?
In the middle of all of them.
In the human. The human becomes the integration layer. Now, the admin has to log into 3 different portals to figure out what happened on Tuesday. They have to mentally stitch the data together. The truck was there according to GPS, the form was signed in the safety app, but the invoice wasn't sent in accounting. The software didn't connect those dots. The human brain did.
So we've just given them 3 more passwords and called it digital transformation.
Exactly. We have digitized the task, but we haven't digitized the responsibility. The responsibility for ensuring coherence still sits 100% on the person. And that is the definition of humans becoming the system.
It paints a sobering picture. You have a business that looks modern, has iPads in the trucks, uses cloud software. But underneath, the operating system is still just Dave from operations and his memory of what needs to happen next.
Dave is tired.
Dave is exhausted. So let's look at the path forward. The source material references NexiServe in the outro, but I appreciate that it treats it as context for the philosophy, not just a product pitch. It focuses on the concept of structural relief. What does that actually mean in practice?
Structural relief means relocating responsibility. It means moving the burden of remembering from the biological brain to the digital architecture.
Can we get a concrete example? What is the functional difference between a tool that records and a tool that carries responsibility?
A tool that records says, here's a form, fill it out if you want. A tool that carries responsibility says, this is a fire inspection for a Type B building. Therefore, I require these specific photo captures before I will allow the job to be closed. And if the photos aren't uploaded, I will automatically trigger an alert to the manager.
Okay, so the system is enforcing the process.
It's enforcing the standard, it's closing the loop. The technician doesn't have to remember the regulation, the system prompts it. The manager doesn't have to check the work. The system validates it against the rules.
And that removes the open loop anxiety we talked about earlier.
Completely. If the system only alerts you when something is wrong, you don't have to spend your day checking things that are right. You move from management by vigilance to management by exception.
That seems to be the key shift. You stop being the glue. You can actually step back and trust that the machine is running the process.
It's about trust. The protective leader we discussed earlier can only stop micromanaging when they trust that the system will catch the ball. Until the software is capable of carrying that responsibility, the leader has to stay in the weeds. It is the only way to ensure quality.
So for the listeners, the operations managers, the owners, the people sending those texts at 7 p.m. just to make sure things were done, what's the takeaway here?
The first takeaway is validation. If you feel burned out, it's not because you aren't working hard enough or because you're bad at your job. It's because you are compensating for a structural gap. You are doing the work that your system should be doing.
That's a massive mindset shift. It allows you to stop blaming your own time management and start looking at your structural design.
And secondly, realize that the solution isn't just more tech, it's better design. It's looking for tools that coordinate responsibility.